Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the relationship between codified law, the rule of law, imposed ideological government, and the police state. So let's look at those things sort of all together. I don't think there can be any doubt at the moment all across the Western world or wherever the globalists are in charge. The legitimacy of all Western governments has now been eroded. All Western governments are now being imposed by the globalists upon the population without the consent of the population. All the big policies of the globalists, again, are being forced and imposed on the Western populace, not only without their agreement, but in open defiance of the wishes of the populace. So we can be under no illusion that an ideological form of government has been imposed on us. But ideological government is, because it's imposed, is also illegitimate because the people didn't choose it. And in order to bridge the gap between their power and their legitimacy, which are separated once the government becomes ideological, they have no legitimacy. In order to bridge that gap, they use the law enforcement authorities, police, courts, FBI, that sort of thing. They use these law enforcement authorities, the apparatus of the state, to crush and intimidate people arbitrarily. So if you have if you defy or disagree with or don't like or make public your views that do not support the ideology or question it or call it into question, then you become an enemy of the ideology. Even though you've committed no crime, you're simply a thought crime, and they will crush you. Now, there are various devices that the globalists use to try and undermine and dislocate and so social unrest in Western societies. Mass migration is one, race, gender, LGBTQ or others, climate change. So those are the main things. So if you oppose those, then you are opposing globalization. And if you're opposing globalization, you therefore are opposing the illegitimate government that is imposing these things on you without your consent. So in order to, again, bridge that gap, the police and the law enforcement authorities are used. Now, how do they go about this, though? It's not easy if you haven't committed a crime. So they have to invent crimes that are uniquely designed to capture people who disagree with them. So if you misgender somebody, that's a crime. If you disagree with climate change, they say it's a crime. But if you're on the other side of it, so if you disrupt the traffic and if you're a climate protester, then they won't arrest you. And if you do get arrested, then the courts will let you go or give you some bullshit slap on the wrist. Whereas if you misgender somebody or engage in anything that opposes the globalization project or questions the legitimacy of the imposed governments, the governments the globalists have imposed on us without our consent or agreement, then that is also an issue. And they'll put you in prison for that, or fine you, or harass you, or give you particularly brutal tax audits and things like that. So they'll find a way of going after you if you disagree with it. So that's how they gain legitimacy, not by actually gaining legitimacy, but by crushing all dissent and making you just so scared to say anything or hold an alternative point of view that no one does say anything. And I guess I don't know how how deep this sinks, and I'm going to do another video on this, but on this specific topic. But within days of the Soviet Union crumbling and all across Eastern Europe, it was as if the communist state had never existed. Nobody believed it or agreed with it or took the position that there was a few that did, but they couldn't see the end of communism quick enough. All the lies, all the propaganda, all the force-fed, communist bureaucratic bullshit, all the requests to sort of, appear to be in full support of it. Any dissent was crushed. And yet the minute it was gone, everybody was saying, nah, it was all bullshit anyway. I never believed any of it, which is an interesting sort of thing, because the state was, we got these people fooled, but they didn't. They just had them intimidated. That's all. none of them, or very few of them, ever believed any of it. It was all nonsense, and they knew it. They knew it was all lies. They knew that newspapers were filled wall to wall of the TV programs with propaganda and lies upon lies. They knew that, but only because they were scared of being arbitrarily arrested, or the state would go after your family as well. Got an elderly mother in a nursing home, they'll threaten to turn her out on the street in the middle of winter without a ration card. So you better behave, or you better do what we tell you. So they'd come at you all sorts of ways like that. But again, it was the government was never legitimate, and in order to again bridge that gap between the power they had and that they wielded brutally and their perception of legitimacy, or the people's perception of legitimacy, they had to use terror in effect to bridge that gap, which is what they did. Now we're seeing that in the West now, where people are being arbitrarily arrested, particularly in the United States, where in my opinion, the last presidential election was rigged and rigged big time, and they had the power to do it, and various organs of an apparatus of the deep state, or that's been infiltrated by the globalist deep state. So that because they were very conscious of their lack of legitimacy, they went way over the top in chasing after people using arbitrary law or arbitrary laws, doing lawfare. So there were corrupt judges, there were corrupt prosecutors, corrupt police, and the list just went on. I mean, it's still astonishing me they could so successfully corrupt so many different organs of government and so many people. But there you go. That shows you how far the deep state's penetrated in the United States and elsewhere across the Western world. You've seen in Britain as well. Now, there are some real diehards, whereas in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe generally, and if you look at Eastern Europe today, they're implacably opposed to nearly all of the globalist projects. Now, why is that? These were very compliant people who were terrorized, or allegedly compliant, who were terrorized in conforming to a brutal communist dictatorship and so on, and yet they were bombarded with propaganda 24/7 for 40, 50, 60, or in the case of the Soviet Union, 70 years. And yet when it was gone, that was it. It was gone. They couldn't get rid of it quick enough. They never believed it, nor did they succumb to it. And there's very few people in Eastern Europe that remember the communist days with any sort of fondness. Now, there are some, 15, 20% of the population that seem to remember, these were the people who had no ambition, sort of low IQ, and they just went along with it. Maybe they had privileged jobs in the administration, and they can't, because they were rewarded for their ideological loyalty. Once that ideology is gone, and they have to rely on their own hard work and talents, then they're fucked. So, but even so, it's the people who've known imposed government who are most against it today. Whereas in the West, there are people that genuinely believe, and I've met some of them, genuinely believe that if we do something good for Black lesbians, then the whole world will somehow magically be a utopian, better place. They don't know how, and they don't know in what way, and they don't know how, the person around the corner will benefit, but just somehow it is. And you've got to sort of say, well, gee, the globalists and their flunkies have done a really good job of indoctrinating some of these people. Some of them you think would be too bright to be indoctrinated, but they're not. So they're going along with it. But now let's have a look at the police state. Again, this is what's used to bridge the gap between the power the government has and the legitimacy they have. And there's no Western government currently has legitimacy. Not one. Not fucking one. And that's scary. You get some regional governments and a few places here and there where you might see it. But in reality, in Australia, for example, every regional government and the federal government are all globalist imposed, every fucking one of them. And you say, well, that's not possible. But I wouldn't have thought it was. When I read George Orwell's 1984 in, I think it was in final year high school. When I read that, I remember as a kid thinking that could never happen in Australia or the West or Britain, America or something. It could never happen. It's impossible. It's just pie in the sky sort of dreaming by Orwell. And now here we are today when instead of a novel from 50, 60 years ago, it's now become an instruction manual for the globalists. I mean, this is insane. I thought as a kid, even as a kid, I believed that the people would never vote for it, our politicians would never allow it, our courts would stop it, our media would expose it, and so on. And yet, all of these checks, all of these balances, all of these obstacles to the globalist project have all been removed. Every fucking one of them. The free media that once existed does not exist anymore. The government politicians fearlessly representing the people, gone. The journalists fearlessly chasing the truth, gone. Independent judges and courts, prosecutors, gone. Every check and balance that would have stopped the globalists has all been removed, gone. Every check and balance that would have stopped the globalists has all been removed. So you've got to hand it to them. They've done a very efficient job at least in removing the obstacles, or most of them. They didn't foresee the internet and social media. That was something that years ago, when the globalists were doing their plans, they couldn't have foreseen. But they're doing everything they can to make sure that gets shut down as well. Now, coming to the idea or the issue of arbitrary law, I mean, it's fairly straightforward. If people go into the Capitol building in the United States and run riot around the halls of power, and they harass senators in elevators, and they bang on doors and create a huge ruckus in a judicial confirmation hearing for the Supreme Court of the United States, and various other activist groups getting in there and creating trouble. The state does nothing. The police do nothing. The state does nothing. The body politic does nothing. It's just, oh, well, they've got a justified complaint. I mean, it's a free country, and nothing gets done. But if you complain about a very suspect election, where a presidential candidate who could barely string a sentence together and who didn't do any campaigning gets by far the highest amount of votes in a presidential election ever in the history of the United States, and by far, not by a little bit, but by a lot, then you have reason to say, hey, that's really weird. A weak candidate who doesn't campaign, who can't string a sentence together, they don't get record numbers of votes. They'll be lucky to get so somewhere. So people that were concerned about that very suspect election, where a lot of questions to this day remain unanswered, and instead the state, with all the force, all the apparatus, every organ of the state has gone chasing after people who committed no crime. They were, at worst, you've got a misdemeanor trespass. At worst, you've got that. But why weren't these other people, that were going in about complaining about the, protesting about the Kavanaugh hearings and so on? Why weren't they arrested? Why weren't they chased? Well, the people who went outside the homes of the Supreme Court justices and made threats and intimidating noises and so on, why weren't they arrested and pursued vigorously by the state? But no. So we see there's two tiers of justice. You oppose the globalist project, be it indirectly or directly, you oppose it, then you will go to prison, and they'll make sure, and they don't care if whether you did or didn't break any law. They'll just, an activist prosecutor will drag you into court, an activist judge will hear the case, and that's it, you're in prison. The evidence or the facts or equally application of the law, no. So we're already at the police state stage, where opposing an illegitimate government, and they're all illegitimate in the West currently, all imposed by the globalists. A globalist imposed government to impose globalist policies upon an unwilling populace. So we're already at a police state, and ideological policing is part of that. And the ideological policing is to not observe codified law, to simply arbitrarily and ideologically interpret the law and to apply it unequally. These people support globalization or are not a threat to it. These people are a threat or a potential threat to the globalisation project. So they're our ideological enemies, and we will prosecute them. And if we have to fabricate evidence, make things up, whatever, so be it. They are a threat to our ideology, and we will crush them. Now, let's come to the Soviet Union in its early days. The government had been imposed at the point of a gun. It was a revolutionary government. Support was modest at best. And they made the decision that protecting the ideology was the primary goal of the state. Running the state was, okay, we'll get around to that, but killing off people that don't agree with us, or don't believe we're legitimate, or question our legitimacy, or doubt our legitimacy, those are the people, those are the enemies, and that's what the police are there for, to kill, crush, or subjugate any who don't accept the legitimacy of this ideological government we've imposed on them. And it was interesting looking at the earlier days of the Soviet Union, say even into the mid 1930s, murder, robbery, beating people half to death and stealing their money, robbery, again assault and so on and so forth. Police didn't really care about it. It's kind of, our job is to protect the ideology. It's not really to protect the citizen from harm from say an assault or a robbery or something like that, or a murder. If it happens right in front of us, sure, we'll deal with it. If it's a party official that gets murdered or robbed, okay, that's again that the ideology kicks back in, so that's important. But if it falls outside of the immediate ideological boundaries that we're looking at, as the police were looking at, again, making the illegitimate government appear legitimate by crushing all dissent to it. So it's a forced legitimacy. If it happens outside of that legitimacy, ideological legitimacy issue, we're not that fussed. We don't really care. And the police were, say, in Moscow or any of the bigger cities, were issuing things like, look, don't walk around with money in your pocket. Don't take a shortcut through a dark alley. Walk in groups on which are not stupid suggestions, but they were. We don't really care about. We're not going to bother about this. Our issues are ideological. You're talking about criminal issues. We don't really care. And now this did ultimately change over time. So by the early 1980s, for example, there were courts that would hear cases where citizen A was taking citizen B to court because she'd trimmed the trees that were overhanging the fence, and the branches had fallen on the rose bushes, and so those petty things that those courts were courts there handling. So it did change over time, and but initially and primarily, and even to the last, the role of the law enforcement authorities was to protect that legitimacy. Now, as the globalist project sort of gets further and further along, the legitimacy gap gets wider and wider. Nobody wants any of the shit that they're doing. Nobody wants this imposed climate green bullshit. Nobody wants the mass migration. Nobody wants LGBTQ pornographic stuff being pushed at 8-year-olds in schools, and none of it is wanted, and the globalists know that. So the legitimacy gap is huge, and they're going to fill that gap, and have started doing it already, and we see it particularly in the United States and Britain. That legitimacy gap is going to be filled by the activities of what would hitherto have been a totalitarian, tyrannical, or banana republic police state. But the issue is the legitimacy, not only of the government, but the policies they're pursuing, which again are all imposed by the globalists, and that legitimacy will be made up for by a police state of terror, arbitrary arrest, arbitrary application of the law, and so on. You've been fantastic today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.